Gentleman from Michigan, years back, Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Steinley, I want to thank you for beautifully capturing the essence of who your daughter was. And I have read everything that I can get my hands on, and I last night watched the clips of various family members describing your daughter, and she is precisely the kind of person that our country desperately needs. So I want to thank you for sharing her with us today.
If I may, I'd like to recognize my sisters here in grief that's supported us during this. They've been there, done that, and we're going to carry this forward, and hopefully some good will come from Kate's death. Thank you.
Yes, sir, which is a perfect segue. I was going to thank Chief Beal and Sheriff Jones and ask that they specifically tell the women and men that work with them how grateful all of us are for folks who go into that profession and that calling. And I suspect that both the chief and the sheriff and the women and men that work with them would tell you that there are lots of really hard parts of being in law enforcement. The crime scene photos never leave your head. You never get them out. The crime scenes themselves you never get out. But the hardest part for most law enforcement officers that I talk to is having to talk to the families like the 4 ladies sitting right behind you. Because they got really good questions. Why? Why did this happen? How did this happen? And those questions go all the way up to the theological. Those aren't just law enforcement questions. They are life-altering, lifelong questions. So tell the folks that you work with how grateful we are. Sheriff, this is something that I am struggling to understand. ICE had probable cause for Mr. Francisco Lopez Sanchez, correct? I mean, he's a 5-time convicted illegal entrant. I think even some of the members of this panel could have won that case in court. So he had probable cause.
That is my understanding.
Why not a warrant? Why a detainer?
You know, I wouldn't claim to be an insider into the dynamics. I've talked to some of my friends in ICE about that particular case. There were certainly failures, but it is an overarching policy-level decision to not challenge or enforce the existing immigration laws or challenge contrary laws that led, at least in part, to the release of this suspect.
But surely even sanctuary cities like San Francisco would have to honor a federal warrant.
Clearly.
Because the Bureau of Prisons honored a local warrant.
Yes, and we've had this discussion about why don't you just create the detainer process into somewhat of a probable cause declaration and have them reviewed by a magistrate. And they say, well, it's caseload prohibitive, but there are 93 federal districts in this country, including 3 territorial district courts. And if we were to supply 1 additional magistrate to each of those districts, I'm sure they could handle the workload of reviewing the probable cause detainer declarations. These things are easily fixable. There just has to be a desire and the political will to be able to do that.
Well, I want to give you one other way to fix it, Chief, and I'll go to you for this one. San Francisco wound up dismissing that warrant, correct?
And I would have expected that. Quite honestly, in my experience, I'd be shocked if that case would have gone forward.
But they could have dismissed it while he was halfway through his federal prison sentence.
Absolutely.
They could have dismissed it when he had a month to go in his federal prison sentence.
That is correct.
They could have dismissed it at any point in his federal prison sentence. Therefore, he never would have been returned to the city of San Francisco.
That is a fact.
And if I were Mr. Steinley, those are some of the questions that I probably would be asking. Is you knew you were going to dismiss this warrant. You knew that. Hell, I'm not even sure drugs are still illegal in San Francisco. So you knew that case was not going to be prosecuted. Why did you wait until he was in your custody to dismiss it, leading to this result? All right, I want to move to one other thing, to both my law enforcement officers. Have you ever noticed throughout the pendency of your careers that folks start with misdemeanors and then they kind of work their way up to aggravated misdemeanors and then they get into felonies. Rarely do you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. Rarely. And when you do go from 0 to 100 miles an hour and commit a murder or a sexual assault or a kidnapping, you're in jail. If you've got a decent prosecutor and a halfway decent case, those folks are already locked up. So since we accept the fact that you don't go from 0 to 100, I think we're missing the boat if we focus solely on felonies when it comes to background checks for folks who want to be in this country. I think you ought to look, all misdemeanors aren't the same. Mm-hmm. You know, speeding is a violation. DUI is worse. Recidivist DUI are worse. Property damage DUI is even worse. Personal injury DUI is even worse. I get all that. But this obsession that we have with only felons, we can only deport felons. Sheriff, has that been your experience, that people who commit misdemeanors always learn their lessons and never graduate?
Clearly some do, but the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And I think there are studies that will demonstrate that there generally is an escalation of criminality, especially when you don't have the consequences to try and deter the behavior. And it's not just felonies that are getting deported, it's only aggravated felonies. So there are many felony convictions that escape scrutiny whatsoever, even under the highest priority of the priority enforcement program.
All right, I'm out of time, but I want to ask one final question because this deals with broader issues of immigration. I want to assume for the sake of argument that there are 11 million undocumented folks in the country. Let's assume that. And I don't know what the percentages is, Ms. Vaughn, maybe you do. Of that 11 million, what percentage have either felony or serious, what we would consider to be serious misdemeanor criminal histories?
I don't know the exact answer to that. ICE estimates that there are more than 2 million criminal aliens in the United States.
All right, let's do this.
1.9 million are removable because some of them have green cards.
Well, let's do this. Just for the sake of conservatism, let's cut that in half. Let's say it's 1 million. Let's err on the side of being conservative. What is the administration's plan for removing those 1 million? To wait until they reoffend? Does anyone know the plan? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm honestly asking. If the strategy is to wait until those 1 million reoffend, somebody's going to be apologizing to a whole lot of moms and dads. Is there another strategy that either of the law enforcement professionals or Ms. Vaughn, is there a strategy other than simply waiting for that 1 million to reoffend? If you can't ask about status, if you can't place a detainer, how are we going to identify that universe, however small it may be? If you're Mr. Steinle, it doesn't matter if it's one. What is our plan to identify that universe before they reoffend? Not all at once.
Mr. Chairman, I just would suggest that the federal government, ICE, certainly should have an idea, based on their database, which isn't shared with local law enforcement, of who those individuals are and who poses significant risk, and they have the ability to take action. And if they need the assistance of local law enforcement, they certainly can request that.
When you say take action, you mean wait for them to do something else wrong where they interact with law enforcement?
They have the ability to take proactive action just like any police officer does.
But there are less ICE agents than there are officers in certain big cities in the United States. There are 5,000. All right, I'm out of time. I can't ask about U visas. I'll close in just a second. I want to recognize my colleague from California for any closing remarks you may have.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you for beautifully capturing the essence of who your daughter was. And I have read everything that I can get my hands on, and I last night watched the clips of various family members describing your daughter, and she is precisely the kind of person that our country desperately needs. So I want to thank you for sharing her with us today.
If I